Welcome to another in our series of conversations with some of the top leaders in the sector. And I've got two fantastic ones here today. And we're going to be talking about what some people have called collective leadership, what others have described as leading in the contested space. And I think that essentially means leading with your peers, with a peer group where you've no sort of, God-given authority to actually lead, but you're leading anyway. And the reason that we're talking about this is not just because it's interesting, although it is interesting. It's because throughout all of the series, we've been exploring how we can bring about bigger, more systemic change, changing those things beyond our direct reach, beyond our footprint, to help the broader population of those that we care about and to deal with some of the root cause issues. And what all of those conversations have highlighted is the need to bring organizations together to collectively work collaborative to basically to generate collective action. And so today we're going to be delving into that topic in the exceptionally good company of the leaders of two of the sector's most high profile collectives. So Jane Ide, who leads ACEVO, or the Association of Chief Executive Voluntary Organisations, which is quite a mouthful, so I'm going to stick to ACEVO. And Sarah Elliott, likewise, I'm going to stick with NCVO. This is Chief Executive of NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. Now, some might say that you're a bit of a double act, that you kind of finish each other's sandwiches almost. That was a Frozen joke, by the way. But that's not always been the case for your two organisations. So before we get into the kind of the nuts and bolts of it, just Sarah, I think you've been involved for slightly longer. Do you want to just give us a bit of the genesis of the relationship that you two have today?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you all this evening. Thanks for joining. So I think Jane and I did join slightly before Jane, but we were actually applying for our jobs at the same time. And I think I remember a walk we went on, Jane, when I think I'd just been appointed and you were just about to be appointed. And we were talking about all the things we could do together if we both got these two jobs. And so I think it was like right from the outset, we both brought a particular attitude to taking on these roles. We were very clear that no organisation can solve all the problems in the world alone. And that we would both be able to bring different strengths to bear on the big challenges that the sector are facing. And so it was really right from the very outset. And we'll get into kind of, it starts off very rosy, but it's not easy. And we'll get into that later. And I think it was a big shift. And, I think at the time, I think it was kind of quite surprising for people to see the two organisations working quite closely. But we were really clear that's what the sector needed at that point in time, which was kind of coming out of the very worst of the first waves of the pandemic, when it had been really clear how much collaboration was going to kind of help the sector kind of get through and kind of thrive into a quite uncertain future. Jane, what would you add?
Well, yeah, I mean, and hello everybody. Really pleased to be here. But I think I was just sorry. This is going to sound like we're finishing each other's sandwiches, which we don't always do, I promise. But I was literally just thinking, as Sarah was saying, I think although Sarah and I first got to know each other properly, well, whatever that would have been, early 2022, as you say, Sarah, when you'd just been appointed. I think I knew I was getting the job, but it hadn't been.
Yeah.
So it was a great time for us to talk. But I think the roots of that relationship actually started before either of us were in these roles. And I don't mean the relationship between me and Sarah. I mean the relationship between ACEVO and NCVO and the whole range of other infrastructure, hate the phrase, but the membership bodies and umbrella bodies in the sector, because it really did, for me, it really came to light very early on in the pandemic. In fact, probably, I'm just looking at the date now, almost precisely to the day, I imagine, 5 years ago, when I was Chief Exec at NAVCA at that point. I remember having a conversation with Sarah's predecessor, Carl, about, hang on, I've got all my members are asking me about furlough, and they're asking me about shutdown, and they're asking me about what do we do about volunteering, and what do we do about this, and what do we do about this, and what do we do about, and there was this whole list of things. And I said to him, I can't deal with all of that. You can't deal with all of that. We can't be trying to duplicate everything for each other. I knew the same was happening at CFG and at ACEVO at that point under Vicky's leadership, across the whole piece. And that was the starting point, I think, for many of us, of that really explicit recognition that we could be stronger by working together and could achieve more by playing to each other's strengths. And I think that gave then, for Sarah and I, when we had that opportunity to start working in collaboration with each other as individual leaders in our, by their new roles, gave us a really good platform to build from.
I'd love to get into a little bit of why that didn't happen before, but that's probably a conversation for another time. And I'm not sure how helpful it is, but just on that collaborative piece, and I think I set it up at the beginning. Where I saw both of you at the ACEVO Fest. Thank you, Jane, for I was going to say inviting, but instructing me to come to a ACEVO Fest. It was brilliant. It was really, really good. And I don't know whether it was just me hearing what I wanted to hear, but it did feel like virtually every panel discussion and every Q&A, it kind of concluded with that sense of we need to work much more collectively. And I don't, so A, was that just me? And B, if it wasn't, what do you think is behind that sectoral shift?
I definitely don't think it was just you, Martyn. I think it is, and you might have heard me saying it. I think I was chairing a panel on the second day, for those that weren't with us at the time, around systems leadership, and it was the thing that we closed the conference with, and quite deliberately so, because I think one of the most exciting, let's be honest, it's been a tough few years for the sector, we know that, and so many of the conversations I'm in, and I'm sure absolutely the same for Sarah, about how tough it is, the challenges, the really difficult job it is to lead in our sector right now. But the most exciting conversations I've been part of have been the ones where people are saying there's something we can do that goes beyond simply working together on a project or looking for a bit of joint funding, but really starts to dig deep into what are the systemic issues, what are the things that are causing the challenges across the boundaries, not just the boundaries of organisations, but the boundaries of different parts of our sector. So I've heard people who work in children's services talking with people who work in homelessness, talking with people who work in domestic violence, and really understanding or really articulating that actually one of the root causes, not the only one, but one of the root causes that they're all faced with is poverty or exclusion or inequity. And when you start to hear those conversations going in at that really deep level, that's really exciting, because we're all here to try and make the world a better place, but actually I think inevitably, if we stay too focused on the one thing our organisation, our charity is there to do, we can only ever tackle that small bit. Now there's a lot to be said for tackling the small bit. I'm never ever going to undermine that at all. It's really key. But where there's an opportunity to pull some bigger levers by coming together, I think it's as I say, one of the most exciting conversations I'm hearing in the sector right now.
It's interesting because when we spoke, Sarah said, that collaboration is one thing, but the level beyond that, systems change. I mean, what were you going to come in and say there, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to kind of agree and just build on what Jane was saying, because I think your question was around why this shift. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, because I guess I joined NCVO as director and then CEO at the time where this shift, I think, if it was already happening before, I think it became more the norm and more the kind of expected, accepted way of leading. And I think some of it is possibly about what's been going on in terms of public services. The sector, this is very simplistic, but the sector used to be the kind of addition to the public sector and public service delivery. We've now largely become the safety net. We pick up the pieces of the state. It's a very different dynamic. And we're not going to solve those systemic challenges alone. One of the best examples I know of this, I'm a trustee, so I'm biased, is Trussell Trust. We want to put ourselves out of business. It's not about Trussell Trust, it's about ending the need for food banks. And we're not going to do that as Trussell Trust. We're going to do that with the food banks, with Citizens Advice, with Shelter, with a whole array of partners that are also trying to tackle the systemic causes of poverty. And so it's a total mindset shift as a leader to put people in communities at the heart, not your organisation, not you and your career and your ego. And I also think there's something else that's happened that's also kind of been COVID accelerated, not necessarily COVID generated, but accelerated, which is around workforce and what workforce are demanding of their leaders as well. And I think our workforce are demanding this kind of more generous leadership, this kind of feminist leadership, if you like, which is definitely not about somebody leading from the front. And I think that also lends itself to, well, of course, it's not just about my organisation, it's about what we are collectively trying to achieve. And Jane and I are collectively trying to support them from different angles and with different lenses, but we're trying to support the voluntary sector and recognise that if we don't at least know what the other's doing, we're not going to do the job as best we can, and we're not going to serve our members in the sector as well as we can. And they're the people and communities we're here to support, but you can kind of multiply that across the sector.
This is probably a bit of a leap, but what, as umbrella organisations, I mean, what role, if any, do you have in that sort of systems change space?
I mean, we're just at the beginning of our new strategy. Jane's just kind of literally launched her new strategy, but certainly the direction of travel, I think, for us as NCVO is, I think we need to lean in more. If I think about, what are the really knotty issues that we need to solve for the voluntary sector, it's some of the stuff that I just described around, the kind of, the welfare state as it was created in 1945 is no more, and the voluntary sector has a very different role to play now. And so NCVO has a very big stake in making sure that public services work better, because one of the key things we could do to make our members' lives easier would be to sort out the public service delivery, commissioning, funding, that whole piece. It's massive. And so we're not going to do that by just saying to government, give us more money. We're going to do that by working with Metro mayors, with the LGA, with, the whole range of partners that would all have the same systems goal. And I think that's what I mean when I say, like, we need to move from just thinking about collaboration to systems change, collective systems change, because actually there's something around kind of swapping notes with your peers that's very different to going, we've got the same goal, we've got different strengths to bring to this problem, and so let's do this very deliberately together. That's a very different thing to a collaboration, which is about kind of two peers that are doing similar things and probably overlapping and rubbing up against each other and maybe even duplicating.
But I also think, and it's interesting, there's a sort of meta thing here, if you know what I mean, that I'm listening to Sarah there, and I'm thinking the way Sarah's answering that question, which is very different to the way I will answer that question, I think is itself an indicator of the fact that we're two actually very different organisations. So I think, so just to explain that a little bit, one of the early conversations Sarah and I had very, very early on, we sort of sat down and said, we need to work out what's different. What people always think that we're the same thing, what's different between us. And there were several things that we identified, but it really kind of boiled down to, in simple terms, NCVO is therefore organisations that make up the sector. ACEVO is there for the individuals that lead those organisations. And so where I'm hearing Sarah talking there about the role that NCVO plays and the perspective and the view that NCVO has on this conversation, I'm thinking actually our role at ACEVO is different. It's much more about convening people, creating opportunities for people to come together and share that thinking. It's about us helping our members to listen to exactly this sort of conversation and to go away and think about, okay, well, what does that mean? That's all right, they're talking about that over there. What does that mean for me in my local area? What does that mean for me in my connections with other charities or other voluntary organisations in my part of the world? And it's more, for want of a better word, it's more personal in that sense, because that is exactly what ACEVO is about. And I think that's where you start to see that we are actually two very different organisations in all sorts of ways that come together to work together in certain things and in certain places, and where we collaboratively think and share our thinking, but we're not looking to duplicate each other, if that makes sense. So that's going slightly off in terms of answering your question, Martyn, but I think that's very much where I would see ACEVO sitting.
But I think we've actually kind of got there over time as well, Jane, because I think we've both through leading, we've both been leading our organisations for several years now, and I think there's perhaps a slightly more sophisticated approach that we've developed with the experience of leading them around what is our lane. And that's not some sort of competitive conversation, but what should we absolutely be doing so we best serve our members? And that clarity has been really helpful, hasn't it? And there's probably things, I think we can say this in the safe space, there's things that we've done together previously that we might not need to do together in future, because we can kind of just trust the other one to get on and do that thing, and we don't necessarily need to be kind of part of it. And we've had conversations about where we compete as well, because let's face it, we need to bring the money in. So I think we've got quite a lot of clarity now around where we would work together and why, and where we wouldn't, because we don't need to.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think we're more likely now to have a conversation about, well, I don't think this is for us to do. Is this something you're doing? Almost more often than we're having the conversation, should we do this together? Because I think we know the bits where we do come together, but actually that clarity.
Yeah, I mean, we had that just last week, didn't we? I said, are you hearing much about the health NHS reforms? And you said, little bit, not loads. And I said, I think we're going to convene some members on this big issue, public services. And you can then just say, well, go and talk to NCVO. They're going to convene a conversation on this.
Exactly what we want to be able to do, because then the conversations. I think the other thing as well is, of course, we do share a lot of members, a lot of member organisations in common. So actually, as a membership body, my first priority is making sure my members get what they need. That doesn't mean they necessarily have to get it from us. We like them to get what they need from us when it's appropriate, but actually, it's really important that they can get what they need elsewhere as well.
Just the way that you two are talking, I don't really need to be here. It's fantastic. It's great. It's like an evening off. But also, you could replace your two organisations with many parts of the sector, to my mind anyway, the way that you're describing it. So this is about shared aims, not duplicating, understanding what is our lane, learning our way into that, based on trust, the fact that, we used to have to do all this stuff together, and now I'm much more comfortable saying, this is your bag, you run with it and we'll help you if you need it, we'll point people towards you, etc. So many conversations I've had with particularly people coming into the sector new and assuming that it's really collaborative, because it's charities and we're all really nice, and then thinking, well, why are we competing here when we should be collaborating, and why, but the fact that you're having conversations about, where do we compete? Where do we collaborate? How are we going to do that? I mean, for me, it's at the style of leadership that you're, as Sarah said, developing, growing into in this sort of space, I think is a style of leadership that is absolutely undervalued in the sector more broadly. And I would be interested in your reflections on, having come from where you come from, but also looking at other leadership styles, what would you say are the key differences for you as a leader now in the way that you think about this stuff versus whether you have in the past or how you see other people?
I think for me, and Sarah used the word earlier, it's the fundamental thing that sits underneath all of this for me is ego, or I won't say lack of ego, because I think it's probably true to say Sarah and I both have some ego. We wouldn't be leaders if we didn't. But I think it's that ability and that necessity as a leader to leave your personal ego at the door, but also for your organisation to leave its ego at the door. And that's I think where a lot of people find it much harder, because I know, to be honest, I think most of the people I get to talk to most of the time within ACEVO's membership and beyond, they do see the benefit. They are naturally people who would like to collaborate, who want to work together. But I think there are some structural barriers to that happening. And I'm going to say this with a certain amount of caution, because I know at least one of my trustees is in the audience this evening. But I think it's certainly true that I've been incredibly well supported by the board at ACEVO. And we have been on a bit of a journey. I mean, Sarah mentioned we've just published our strategy, and actually I think some of the really rich and meaningful and deep conversations we had as a board around the development of that strategy really got into this space of, well, which bits should ACEVO be doing and which bits should ACEVO not be doing? And if ACEVO's not doing them, is there somebody else there to do them? Which is a big question. Because I think one of the tendencies in our sector is, oh, there's a problem, nobody else is solving it, we better go and solve it, which of course can kind of get in the way of a number of things. But I think that support I've been given by the board to not always go out and say, we've got to win that space, we've got to hold that, we've got to get more headlines than they do. I think that for me is perhaps the biggest change I suspect in leadership models. I mean, I've not been in the sector for 30 odd years, but I've been around organisational worlds for several decades. And I think that's the shift that I have seen. In some ways, I suspect we're a little bit behind some of the parts of the world, so to speak. But I think for me, it is that fundamental thing of being given permission and being enabled and being allowed to say there is more at stake than our organisational ego. The challenge around that, and I'm sure we'll get back into this, I don't want to say too much without giving Sarah some space, but the challenge around that is, as a charity, your charitable objects, the regulation, all the requirement, you know, how do you balance that ability to kind of step outside of your lane, but in your own lane, if that makes sense, is quite a tricky one, I think, for some leaders in our sector.
Just on that point, Sarah, just said there's one specific thing that when you come and respond to that, I would really value your thoughts on, is you mentioned that you're trustee at Trussell as well, which is, you know, explicitly set out to put itself out of business. I've got Emma joining me in a couple of months in June for one of these, along with I think Julie Bentley is partnering her. But I got the impression from my conversations with her that you as a set of trustees have kind of reconciled that with, as Jane was describing there, the onus on you to protect the charity and work towards its objects, etc. And has there been, both in terms of NCVO and the way that your trustees are looking at this stuff, but also in your role as a trustee in other organisations, has there been a shift there? I mean, how are you seeing it play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think running the Trussell Trust Board, we're really clear of what our charitable objects are and what's the best theory of change to achieve that. And it's really clear that just providing more and more and more food handouts is not a sustainable solution and not a desirable solution. And so, of course, the alternative is how do you actually end the need for the food banks? And by doing that, we don't need a charity that's called Trussell Trust to give out food anymore. So that's a really clear vision, and everybody around the board table is absolutely razor focused on that. I would say, and I think this is true for NCVO and probably ACEVO and Trussell, it's maybe a little easier to collaborate when the money's good. Certainly, so a few jobs ago, feels like a lifetime ago, I worked in the epilepsy world. There are 26 epilepsy charities in the UK, which is a lot for a condition which is relatively small compared to some other health conditions. And we did collaborate as Epilepsy Society, one of the biggest, there's two big charities, Epilepsy Society, Epilepsy Action, but we wanted our brand there because we wanted supporters and we wanted donors, and that is where it gets hard, and I don't think we can get away from that, and I think that's really important. In terms of the NCVO board, I think we've been on a bit of a kind of up and down, round and round kind of fairground ride around collaboration, because in some ways where we came from on collaboration was different to where ACEVO came from. When I first took over as chief exec, there was a huge need for a real reset of NCVO's role in the sector. I think we drifted into a space which was a bit think tanky and a bit telling the sector what to do. Nothing wrong with think tanks, but that's not what NCVO is. We're a membership body. We were perhaps a bit regulatory sometimes and sort of looking down on the sector, saying bad sector. And I don't think that's the space that we wanted to be in and thought we could best serve the sector in. So there was this need to kind of build trust and build relationships. And that was like the imperative. And I would say perhaps sometimes we did collaboration and that almost became the end in itself. I think we've got a much more sophisticated approach now, but we almost needed to do that to build that trust across kind of our peers in the sector, like ACEVO. I can see Adela from Charity Comms is on the group too tonight, and you know she's one of that group of civil society organisations. While that was going on, I also had members saying, we need NCVO to lead on this. We need you to be a very visible leader. And so I've been like balancing this, and Jane talked about balance, and I'm still balancing it. How are you a generous leader while also being the biggest infrastructure body in the sector? And we can't get away from this. And, you know, Jane and I plays out when we try and work together. I've got this huge policy team. Jane has one or two people who play lots of different roles. And yeah, that can be quite hard. And there's never a collaboration that doesn't come up as kind of a dynamic to work through. So I'd say that's the hard bit for us, actually.
One thing that I wondered, you mentioned a little bit there, and Jane sort of touched on it, well, indirectly, that I've got people on the call. I just need to think through how I'm going to say this. more generally, because you're a representative, membership organisation, and you've got to keep people on side. I mean, how the topic is self-censorship, I guess. How careful do you need to be about if we came back on this call in X number of years when you guys have kind of moved on to your next roles, and I say, tell me about that time when you were at ACEVO, let's have it all. Would that be very different? I mean, how constraining is it?
Do you want to go first, Jane? Go on.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I would say, Martyn, I'm always very, very careful to say that we are not a representative body. We do not represent our members. We work for our members. We support our members. They choose to be members of our organisation for all sorts of reasons, but we don't claim to represent them, because I've got 1,760 odd members and I wouldn't dream of trying to corral them all into one space. I think it's a little bit of chicken and egg, in the sense that even just looking back 3 years now, and it has only been 3 years, I think when Sarah and I first sort of publicly, I can't remember what it was, I think we did a blog or something, and something came out, and it was like, yeah, Sarah and Jane are working in a different, oh my God, ACEVO and NCVO, they're working together. This is shock horror. But I think there is something about, as a leader, whatever organisation you're leading, you have to be aware of the fact that the way you lead will change the way people think about leadership, if that makes sense. And I think the fact that we are prepared to be, I've just seen a chat, I didn't get a chance to read the whole comment, but somebody in the chat just said this is a refreshingly honest conversation. I think we hear that quite a lot, and I'm really glad of it, because we are honest people. I mean, yes, of course, there's always going to be things that we have to be more discreet about, more cautious about, but that's more human life than it is anything else, I suspect. And I think it is important that people can see that leaders of organisations who may be in very different places for all sorts of reasons can work together. Because actually, one of the things we're talking about here is how two leaders who actually get on really well together in organisations where there is a clear need for us to collaborate in some things and a clear reason for us not to in other things, can work together. I think there's an even more powerful conversation to be had about what happens if that's not the case. What happens if one of us leaves and the one that takes over actually, the other one left behind doesn't get on with them? What happens then? What happens in those parts of the sector? As Sarah said, there are so many parts of the sector where organisations do need to come together in order to get the best outcome for the beneficiaries that they're all serving. But you can't rely on individuals who happen to get on well together to do this. It has to be a model of leadership, and it was something Mike Adamson said. I mean, again, apologies to anybody that wasn't with us last week in the conference, or before in the conference, but that session that we had around about systems leadership, Mike Adamson, formerly Chief Executive of the British Red Cross, who's done a lot of thinking around this, said it needs to become culturally unacceptable for a leader not to be collaborative. And I think that is a really, really key point. The models of leadership that we need to be working towards, that many of us are already trying to work towards, that I think we at ACEVO would espouse, have that openness, that collaboration, that willingness to, as I say, leave the organisation and personally go at the door when it's not helpful. How else are we going to make the world a better place? Because let's face it, the old models haven't actually achieved doing, quite what we might have hoped. So we've got to try something differently.
Yeah. So, Sarah, I don't know whether you want to catch that question that Jane threw out, because I think Mike said those words actually in our very first session on systems change. He and Juliette Bouverie were here, but Jane posed the question there. What happens when, well, I guess from your perspective, when Jane gets axed and they bring a monster in, but when those personal relationships aren't necessarily there, what are your thoughts? It's your experience on that.
I mean, I think it's really important, and what it actually brought to mind is another challenge in working as NCVO and ACEVO, and it's the same in other partnerships that NCVO is involved in, I've been involved in previous lives, and that is that it can't just be about two leaders, because actually it's a whole organisation. And I find it fascinating, like, you know, the organizational psychology almost, that means that Jane and I will agree we're going to do something together, and then it sort of gets translated down the organization, and then it all goes, you know, very, very hard because the teams somehow haven't got behind the collaboration in the same sense. And or of course, when you're sitting in, I don't know, the corporate partnerships team, and you've got a big target, you don't want me to work with our competitor in the corporate partnership space, because let's face it, that's where Jane and I do compete a lot. And so there's something around, I think Jane and I have got a real responsibility to do this. Like, as a leader, you need to put the architecture in place so that if you step away, whether it's for a short time or permanently because you've left, the organisation has the sort of sustainability beyond you and the personality of you. And the way you do that is by building great teams around you who share the same ethos, and really understand why it's part of the business plan to be working collaboratively on these systems issues, and why we're not doing it on our own. And I happily put my hands up, we've not got there yet as NCVO, and I think Jane would probably say that the same with ACEVO, but I think we will get there because, you know, we've got a great team of people who really, really want to change the world for the voluntary sector. And it's around kind of how we get everyone behind this kind of ways of doing it. So yeah.
I would absolutely agree with Sarah though, but I also think this is where the why comes in. Why are you collaborating on this? Why are you not collaborating on that? Because when I think back over the last 3 years, and Sarah and I haven't talked about this, so you know, I don't know whether she'll agree with me or not, but I think, as you can tell, you know, we can have a great conversation. We can go for a walk somewhere and come up with about 15 new ideas of things that we ought to be thinking about doing for the sector. The things that then have not gained traction, I think, with the teams, actually, when I look back now, the teams are probably right. You know, actually, well, why that? That doesn't make, why are you asking us to do that when we've already got this, and this to do?
Yeah.
Whereas the things where there has been a really clear reason why, and I'm thinking, you know, the work that's going on at the moment around the covenant and the relationship with government, which is probably the absolute crux of where we are collaborating incredibly effectively right now. It's been patently obvious to my team, certainly, and I think probably to Sarah's, that actually, yes, this is something we all need to get behind. So in some ways, I think Sarah's absolutely right. You have to have that way of building in the structures so that it goes on beyond us, but it will only go on beyond us if there is a real solid why underneath it. And if there isn't, then it shouldn't really matter if one of us leaves, the other one leaves, whatever. That's fine. You know, we carry on being friends, but we don't carry on working together. That's not a problem because we weren't achieving what we were setting out to achieve. That's slightly the wrong way around of putting it, but you know, you get my drift. You get my drift.
Yeah, I'd also suggest, I think it was Sarah was talking earlier about the sort of feminist leadership. I think I agree with everything you've said. I also think that if you have more of a kind of command and control style culture, it's harder for people to collaborate because they're waiting for you to tell them what to do. They don't have the freedom to go out there and co-create stuff because they have to get it agreed with you. But the second thing is that you're kind of setting up an organization which is very dependent on your personality. Somebody else comes in to it and everybody looks to them to be, you know, are we still collaborating? Are we still doing this? So that more collective approach internally within your culture, that more empowering approach, does tend to, you know, for me, it's key to embedding some of these behaviours that you're looking to embed. And I just like the way it sort of links back to one of Sarah's earlier observations. Are you going to come in there, Sarah?
No, I was just going to agree with you. I mean, I think it's all part of a continuum of kind of, well, what feminist leadership is, and kind of it what happens internally reflects out externally. It's very obvious externally when things aren't working well internally, and kind of vice versa. And I don't think we've got it right yet. We're still getting there. I mean, I've been leading a huge program of cultural change at NCVO over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's not done yet, and there's still work to do. And I think, you know, where there are sometimes tensions in some of those partnerships, it's probably some of that playing out. Though I think Jane's absolutely right as well. You know, I mean, every CEO on the call will know you can't just tell your teams what to do, because they'll tell you exactly why it won't work and why you shouldn't be doing that great vision you've got. And that's why you employ brilliant people to work alongside you to kind of make your not so brilliant ideas into better ideas.
So you've both just been through, I mean, it's quite timely actually, you're both coming to the end of or at the end of a strategy process. And how have these kind of revelations, these thoughts, these sort of cultural imperatives almost, how have they affected the way that you've approached that process of creating a new strategy? Has it, has it been a sort of non-traditional approach, or hasn't that been a big factor for you?
Well, I'm probably a little bit ahead of the curve, because Sarah's just going through this process. I'm not sure quite what a traditional approach would be, to be quite honest. I mean, for us, it was very much about making sure that again, we're a membership body. The absolute non-negotiable in this process was that we had to find ways to hear members' voices and hear from them, what they thought we were doing well, what they thought we weren't doing well, where they wanted us to go, what they wanted us to focus on. I think the board absolutely really put heart and soul into it, and I genuinely pay credit to my trustees for that, for the time and energy they put into that, the staff, and also conversations with, talking to people like Sarah, talking to some of our other stakeholders and collaborators, because I think in this context, one of the threads that really runs through our strategy is absolutely that understanding that we cannot achieve our strategic goals by ourselves. Some of them are really quite ambitious. They're talking about completely changing, or not completely changing, but changing the narrative around leadership development in the sector, for example. We can't do that by ourselves. We need to be working with Association of Chairs. We need to be working with the Charity Commission. We need to be working with NCVO. We need to be working with all sorts of other players to achieve some of these things. So at the very least, there had to be some conversations that said, particularly as we got towards, I think with any strategy, you have that kind of going up the hill, and then you get to the top, and then it starts to, you think, hallelujah, we're just
it all makes sense now.
Yeah, it all makes sense now. And I think before we got to as we got to the top of the hill, and before we got to that point of actually getting it signed off, there had to be some at least starting point conversations that said, look, we want to say this in our strategy. This could have implications for you. How do you feel about that? And it not in the sense of having other people say, no, you shouldn't do that, or yes, you should do that, but actually just being, it is the starting point for a collaborative, generous collaborative relationship, which is the phrase we've used in the past. Because apart from anything else, I don't want to drop something on somebody else's desk and not having. I cut my teeth in press office management, and one of my basic rules was you never send out a press release with somebody else's name in it without talking to them first. It's the same principle. We have to talk about it. But I think also those principles also fed through. And again, I go back to something I said earlier. Some of the really rich conversations we had around the board around the strategy were very much about, we can't do everything that needs doing. And if there are things that need doing and we are not the right people to be doing them, do we try and step in and fill those spaces? Or do we deliberately say, actually, we can't do everything? Because if we try and step in, that stops other people stepping in. Now, there isn't a hard and fast rule on this. Sometimes we will step in to do something because our members are asking us to do it. And because it's such a key driving force that we clearly need to do something. But that's kind of where I think in a membership body you have to be able to balance on the seesaw a little bit. But I think for me, it was interesting because one of the stakeholders one of the members actually who responded when we shared the second draft of the strategy came back and said, interesting, you don't seem to mention collaboration in it anywhere. And I thought, actually, you're probably right. I don't think we do. Because it kind of threads through everything. It's about co-developing partnerships. It's about developing models of leadership. It's about really working together. I think the other element, and Sarah will know this because we have had this conversation, because we can have honest conversations, I think it also marks potentially a shift for us that in some ways, because of that personal connection and because of the history of the two most high profile membership organisations, all of that stuff, it was inevitable that we started our collaborative journey in that respect with, and that implies we've not had any collaborations before, which is not true, but I think that this really key platform started with NCVO. But I think our strategy is showing us that actually there will always be things we'll want to do with NCVO, but actually some of our bigger things we actually need to be doing with other collaborators because they're not NCVO space. And that's part of being grown-ups in this situation.
Oh, I'm glad you said.
I always love Sarah, but she won't.
No. I'm really glad. I'm really glad you said that. I mean, this is really interesting. I mean, we're still in the fuzzy bit going up the hill, but I think where we've got to is the status quo for charities can't continue. You know, there is so many bits of it that are, you know, broken in terms of kind of, you know, how we deliver services, how we campaign, what we're trying to do, how we fundraise, etc. We need big shifts over the next 5 to 10 years. And who can NCVO convene for action around that? And it might not be the people who we've been convening for action over the last 5 years. You know, we're thinking, you know, this is off the top of my head really, like housing associations, Google, Serco. I'm sure some members will hate that, but you know, these are all people who are working in these systems and these spaces that where we need to bring about seismic change. And so yeah, I think there will be, it's going to be very collaborative, but in a much more kind of strategic systems, probably multi-sector approach. I think in the Venn diagram where NCVO and ACEVO are overlapping, there probably isn't going to be as much overlap, but that's a great thing for the sector, because why would you pay 2 membership fees for the same thing? There is this really important bit, particularly around the right of the sector to campaign, you know, the issues that are absolutely front of mind for Jane's members that will always be bread and butter for us, where we will work together because we know we'll achieve more if we do that. And what's great is we've just had 4 years practicing doing that really well, so we know how to do that and make that work in a way that we probably didn't 4 years ago.
The things that are bringing, not quite bringing tears to my eyes, but you know, really, really pleased to hear. This is a bit of a, you know, soapbox for me because I spend a lot of time with charities helping them develop strategies. The way that you described, you know, setting strategic goals that we cannot achieve alone as a start, because so much flows from that. You have to then get clear on your role in terms of how those things are going to come about, because you can't do them alone. You have to get, I think you described, you know, the partnerships and collaborations, they're not a program that's bolted over here and it's got a title of partnerships. They are a core vehicle for delivering your strategy because it's dependent on those kind of behaviors. And it drives you to answer those questions around, so who do we actually need to convene rather than who are we comfortable convening and who do we know? All these things, you know, like circuit, because they are the people that influence, or potentially that's the group around the table that have the most ability to influence the systems you're hoping to change. And everything's, for me, so many things, it's a bit of a nerdy point, but so many things flow from that. You select your strategic goals and a lot of things right down to the culture of your organization, because people will behave in a way aligned with their incentives as much as anything, you know. And we say culture eats strategy for breakfast. If you choose the wrong strategic goals, it will just anchor your traditional culture in there, and you'll find it incredibly difficult to do a lot of these things. I'm absolutely delighted to hear that.
I just, sorry, Martyn, I just wanted to,
no, go.
Just because I remember, I mean, years ago, long before I came into the sector, I was working in a bit of the civil service, and my role as a director there was around organisational culture. And we had a real challenge because it was very siloed. Even within the organisation, everybody was very siloed. And the chief exec said to me, what are we going to do about it? How do we change this? And I said, we put collaboration into people's job descriptions and their objectives. Because the minute people are being appraised against how well have you collaborated with your colleagues in the team across the floor, as opposed to have you hit this target, have you got that KPI, it becomes a KPI, and then it becomes embedded into the way the organisation works. The other thing I was going to say as well is I think, again, it comes back to if the principles of collaboration, if that principle of this is how we want to change the world as an organisation, we cannot do this by ourselves. Therefore we know we have to be working with others in partnerships and collaborations and systems change, whichever way you want to approach it. That's how you absolutely nail this issue of, and as I say, absolutely not the case in my organisation, but my background's in small charities, and I know that this can be a real challenge, particularly for some trustee boards. That's how you nail this issue of, actually, our job is to go beyond our organisational boundaries, not beyond our objectives, but our charitable objects, but beyond our boundaries. And that's where a board can really get behind this. Or if they're not going to, then that's where you start to have to think about, well, is, you know, are we going to be fit for the future? Effectively, is going to be the question. I think the boards will have to ask themselves in coming years, because it's not going to work if people aren't doing that.
So it provides the why that you were talking about is so imperative earlier, but it is also it is the challenge, the test, the acid test for the organisation.
Yeah.
Are we actually going to do this or not? Are we serious?
Mm.
Yeah. And in your experience, Sarah, have you got anything to shine on what Jane's just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's something about kind of how the sort of culture of it all starts at the top. I said in my last answer around, you know, you've got to get your team aligned behind this, you've got to have the scaffolding in place, but there's also the sort of looking up as well. There's something around kind of the culture around the board table as well that allows you to, just as Jane said, I think that's a really good way of putting it, go beyond your organisation's boundaries, not beyond your charitable objects. I don't necessarily think the way, and we won't get into like charity governance models tonight because nobody needs that at like quarter 10 to 6 on a Monday, but there's something around the way charities are constituted that doesn't necessarily naturally lend itself to collaboration. But I think if the board culture is right, it can work. And so, yeah, there's something around what goes on at board level that's also really important.
There's a phrase that I'm going to quote from a Jane Ide, I believe it was. As a sector, we're still founded on the principles of business. So we tend to look at the world through a very kind of individualistic, what can we, you know, what can our growth be? What can our reach be as an organisation? And what can our goals be as an individual organisation? How can we compete in order to get, you know, more room at the table and more voices? You know, irrespective of whether that's, I mean, most of the time, I use the old term beneficiaries, but you know, our constituents, they don't actually care whether it's one organisation or another organisation. They care about the change.
Of course. I do think there's also something, Jane mentioned small charities, I do think there's something about the size of organisations and the responsibilities of larger organisations. And I see NCVO as a larger organisation, certainly in the spaces that we play in, although there's lots of organisations much bigger than us. And I do think, you know, if we're going to talk about kind of systems leadership across multi-sectoral systems, but we need to work as a system within the sector as well. And, you know, again, let's use Trussell, my favourite example, but, you know, we are, I say, big national charity working locally with lots of very small community organisations who are absolutely at the front line of the food emergency. And that takes a particular generous style of leadership to do that and to give up the space and give up the power. And I think that's there's a responsibility there on large charity boards as well. I mean, where I think it's worked really well, I know it's not all been easy, and Jane can talk to this because I think she has the scars from when she was at NAVCA, is what Red Cross and NAVCA did around the voluntary sector emergencies partnership, which of course is a huge coalition of charities. That wouldn't work if Red Cross didn't lend it its brand and logo and resources and infrastructure. So this is like me looking out from the outside, looking in into that. But it also wouldn't work if it was just Red Cross trying to do everything, because like it's the beauty of small and large there.
Yeah, and I mean, I've said it publicly in the past, and Mike Adamson was Chief Executive of British Red Cross at the time. The BCSEP was one of the things that came out of the post-Grenfell era. And if Mike, I genuinely think if Mike had not had the humility to say, actually, British Red Cross didn't do as well as it should have done at Grenfell, and we needed to be better connected with small local charities, that wouldn't have happened. That work would not have happened, and it did go on to deliver some really and is still delivering some incredible collaboration across the sector, across shapes and sizes and types of organisations. But I think the other thing as well that I was thinking about just then was there's, you know, if you think of the demography of our sector, it's not just about large organisations and small organisations. I think one of the things that is really exciting and gives me a lot of hope for the future is younger organisations. And I don't just mean younger leaders, although they do tend to have younger leaders, but I genuinely don't think this is an age thing. And I have to say that because I'm 20 years older than Sarah. So, you know, it's sort of at least, and I don't think it's about an age thing. But I think what I'm seeing is those organisations that have been set up in the last 10, 15 years, maybe even less than that, this is part of the way they do things, in exactly the same way as feminist leadership is part of the way they do things, in exactly the same way as anti-oppression is part of the way they do things. This isn't a new thing for them. This is how they work. And I think the bigger challenge is for those of us that are leading organisations that have a longer history. And I mean, ACEVO's not that old. We're only coming up to 30 years, I think, in a couple of years' time. But there is that sort of generational thing of organisational life and lifespan that I think it is harder to shift these things in an organisation that has been quite embedded. And I'm really conscious that I am one in a chain of, I'm now the fourth chief executive of ACEVO, and others who have gone before me have done work in different ways of shifting and shaping where ACEVO sits on this journey. So I actually came into an organisation where I had it already kind of laid out for me. But I think that for longer standing organisations and people leading those longer standing organisations, it is harder. And I think, again, you know, you can't ask for a longer standing organisation than NCVO. I think, you know.
I was just going to say, Jane, wait till ACEVO gets to 105.
I think that might be on my lifespan, Sarah, but yes, exactly.
But yeah, no, it amazes me how, well, you just said culture eats strategy for breakfast, like, you know, the older organisations, and I see this in other old organisations in the sector, it really, yeah, it lives on. Doesn't matter how much you do to change it, things will re-emerge, because yeah, and I find it amazing. Even if all the staff have changed, it still lives on as like the cultural norms of how the organisation was, and also how people receive you as well. You know, they have their idea of your organisation. It's normally a few years out of date. So yeah, interesting.
Well, I think that's a good, I mean, just before we finish then, because I know that you said at the beginning, Sarah, I think it was you, you know, in the past we may have sort of lectured or hectored or critiqued the sector, and that's not where we want to be. But you have a unique perspective, both of you. Well, I don't know if you can both have a unique, but you do. In that you get a more comprehensive view of the sector and its various different sort of niches and behaviours and all this sort of thing. So, and you've also gone through these experiences of developing different ways of looking at the world through your organisations post-pandemic, with the way that you're collaborating together, but also through these sort of strategic processes and starting to think about systems change, etc. So not as a lecture, but as an offering of insight. How would you package up, summarise, and explain your thoughts to those of us, because most of us on this call are from you know, sort of fairly traditional, longer standing, larger organizations. So in a nutshell, what advice or insight would you offer?
So this is definitely cribbed off someone else, I don't know who, but I think the one thing I would sum up this discussion as is you can achieve the most amazing things if you do not care who gets the credit.
And
Fantastic.
I would say you've got to know the why. If you don't know why this is important, if you don't know why this is important to the people or the cause that you're there to serve, you're not going to be able to bring other people on the journey. If you do, you can absolutely bring other people on the journey with you. And as we've said, that cuts through so much. And yeah, I think we've, as I say, we've always talked, haven't we, Sarah, about generous collaboration, not just collaboration, but generous collaboration. And that's always been really important for me. And I think it's about giving that space to other people, letting them get things wrong sometimes, because you're going to get things wrong sometimes, and having that generosity of spirit that says, okay, let's work this through, let's see where that goes. But you have to know why.
And I know that just in terms of sort of future steps, so your organisation, Jane, has asked me to run that system strategy.
Yep.
So you know, systems-led organisational strategies, and that's in
It's on our
October.
website, folks, if I want to give it a quick plug.
There you go. But I know that each of you are thinking about doing more stuff in this space. What's on your agenda for the next year or two in terms of trying to help organisations convene, collaborate, connect?
I think actually, you know, joking aside, I think things like inviting you and others to come and facilitate those conversations. As I say, I go back to our role at ACEVO is to convene. It's to give our members and non-members sometimes the opportunity to come together and have conversations and learn from each other and reflect on what they're hearing and go away and think about it. And that is really what we're about. And I think just holding that mirror up to the sector and saying, look, here's a thing. Here is the thing. Don't be scared of it. This is how valuable it can be. You know, we've made a start, but we are not the experts. Here's some other people that are exploring it. Here's some other people that are thinking about it. And I think that very much sits for me within our strategic objectives. So I'm okay with the board on us doing that one. But I think that's really what our role has to be. It's to have one of the things I know, having led this organisation for 3 years and previously at NAVCA, is that those of us that are given a platform by the roles that we have, we can start conversations, we can get narratives moving, and having this conversation tonight is part of that process. And that's really, I think, where I sit and where we sit at ACEVO.
Excellent. Sarah?
I mean, you said it yourself, we've got this kind of unique and I think very privileged position in the sector where we can kind of see lots of different things from a vantage point. And so I often think that the most valuable thing I do is when I hear about one little thing and I hear about another thing and I connect two people up and then I just step away from it. And actually it's nothing really to do with me or NCVO, but something grows out of that. And it's been a source of real frustration to me that we've not been able to mass produce that yet. And it was very much part of my kind of vision for the last sort of 3-4 years to really get members to be able to connect with each other, but also for us to be connecting with people trying to achieve the same things as us. I still hold this vision, and I think there's something about how can we help members to find each other, but NCVO doesn't need to be part of that, and it doesn't need me to do these personal introductions, because across 17,000 members, probably not going to get us very far. So that's absolutely something that I'm holding on to, and there's obviously a tech solution in there as well. I think the other really important thing for me is how the sector and members relate to government, and that's the covenant, and then how do we bring the covenant to life so we can have a genuine partnership with government, which will sometimes be antagonistic and will sometimes be less antagonistic, but getting to a point where we can do that. And it isn't how it's been for the last 5, however many years, when it's just been so difficult. And I know from talking to members how important that is at all levels, not just national government, but local government, local health systems as well. So they're my 2 kind of big prizes. Yeah, just give me another 10 years, see if I can do that.
Well, we should be watching with great interest. And thank you both enormously for joining, and thank you everybody else for listening. And the next session that we've got is on Thursday, 8th of May, where we will be looking at that kind of big small relationship. In a sense, we'll be looking at community building, developing communities, developing movements with Matt Hyde, who I'm sure everybody knows, and Dame Julia Cleverdon, who I'm sure everybody knows. So Lloyds Bank Foundation and sort of Natural Lottery Communities Foundation. And then in June, we'll be back, as I think I mentioned before, with Julie Bentley and Emma Revy from Trussell. But for now, thank you so much, Jane. Thank you so much, Sarah. It was brilliant having you on.
It's been a joy. Thank you very much. I mean, I haven't seen Sarah for ages, so it's been great to have a chance to catch.
It's been a good night, hasn't it? Thank you so much, Martyn. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's been lovely to see you all.